Okay, welcome everyone. We're really excited. I'm Cynthia Guazda. I'm the Community Services Librarian at Hagaman Library, and I'm excited to welcome you all here tonight for Poetry Then and Now with Jim Kelleher, poet Jim Kelleher. Welcome to Jim, and thank you all for coming tonight. I'd just like to introduce Jim. He's published 3 books of verse, many individual poems, such as in the Boston Teachers Union newsletter, the Litchfield County Times, and also in other publications such as Yankee Magazine, the Christian Science Monitor. Jim has an MFA, a Master of Fine Arts in Poetry, and teaches writing and literature at Northwestern Connecticut Community College. So thank you very much, Jim, for doing this for us tonight. So what we're going to do is I'm going to share the screen as Jim reads some poetry by some of the great writers, of course, Shakespeare and Yeats, and and also his own poetry. So I will be sharing those on the screen, and then there'll be plenty of time for questions. So without further ado, thank you, Jim, very much for doing this, and we'll start.
Great. Thank you, Cynthia, for the invitation and the opportunity to do this. I'm a very informal person, and this is going to be a very informal sort of presentation. And I'm going to divide it into 3 sections. The first part, which will be relatively brief, is to talk a little bit about the history of poetry on the assumption that maybe you don't know anything at all, although I'm sure you do. And also to tell you a little bit about myself and how it came to be that I identified myself as a poet. That's section 1. And then in section 2, I'm going to look at 4 poems by Shakespeare, William Butler Yeats, Langston Hughes, and Mary Oliver, and examine them as poems, where we'll talk a little bit about the craft of poetry. And then I'm going to stop there and I'm going to maybe answer some questions, if you have some. And the last section, which will also be fairly brief, will be my reading 2 of my own poems, which I chose. And that's how I'll conclude, okay? So 1, 2, 3. When poetry started, there was no writing. Think about a tribe of people, a primitive tribe around a campfire. They don't have books, or very possibly they don't even have an alphabet, but they have speech. So the earliest poetry was always verbal. It was meant to be heard. And it was not distinct from music. It was one with music, just as it is today. I think today we have a misconception that poetry is very learned material that appears in anthologies and in university periodicals, and occasionally in the New Yorker magazine. But it's so much more than that. If you imagine yourself at a campfire, the center of this group of people is that fire, which is providing food, which brings people together, and warmth, which is essential for everyone in the community. And it's also providing protection. Now think about that. It's protection against the cold. It's protection against wild animals that might be lurking out there in the dark. And it's also protection against any of the demons or fears that we people tend to project. Not just our fears, but our conflicts. So we come to the campfire to be comforted on many different levels. While we're there, we might sing. The earliest poems were psalms from the Bible, songs to God, songs of praise, songs of lamentation, songs of supplication. There also might be chants, because it's fun when people raise their voices together. Now, I was thinking I should try to find a chant to illustrate this, but I thought of something or two things more contemporary to illustrate the pleasure in a group of people chanting, which is a very basic form of poetry. And looking at your faces and looking at my own face, you probably remember what it was like as a kid for the ice cream truck to come around. And what you would hear is, you scream, I scream, we all scream for ice cream, you know? And everyone goes off when that bell arrives and the truck pulls up with the good humor man. I was also thinking recently there was a baseball player who had a famous career for the Yankees. And at the very end of his career, in his final games, the people in Yankee Stadium would chant his name. Just a name chant. We would go, Derek Jeter, Derek Jeter. And people invested this simple chant, which was just his name, with all kinds of loaded meanings. The gratification he had brought them, the example he provided to a whole generation of kids. It became almost mystical. It certainly became more than ordinary. And one of the things I promised you in the write-up in the form of a question was whether poets could do magic tricks. And I want to point out to you where sometimes at their very best, poets can approach doing magical things. And a magical thing is what you experience and what you feel. So coming back to that campfire, people are chanting, people are singing, people are bringing in musical instruments to accompany the lyrics. And at its best, it could be a party. You know, it could be like almost like the predecessor to a modern day concert. There might be one or two individuals at that campfire who have a position as a leader or an authority figure. Now, the first thing you're going to think of is some kind of a witch doctor. But I don't want to use that because it's sort of a loaded term. How about someone who can see the future? A soothsayer or an oracle who looks into the fire and predicts what might occur the next day or the next month or the next year, and maybe has some props. Could be a musical instrument like a rattle, could be some herbs, could be something that he burns or she burns. But this figure is taken to have some sort of knowledge, some sort of capacity to affect reality, to make reality change. Whether you want to call that person a witch doctor or an oracle. The oracles, if you look at ancient Greece, the oracles were invested with tremendous authority. You look at Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, there's a fellow named Tiresias who's always predicting what's going to happen next. And everyone's always going to him to get his take on things. He also appears in a play by Sophocles, 300 years later. So we identify certain people in our society as being kind of different. Maybe having a different link or a greater capacity to to feel things, to intuit things than the great majority of us. Now, once we get past this tribal place, and we get into formal history, and we have writing, we start to write down the stories and the songs that we heard around the campfire. And once the Greeks have passed and the Romans have passed, we get into, at least in Western civilization, a time when the Roman Catholic Church becomes kind of preeminent in society, along with different monarchs in different countries. Now, I was raised in the Roman Catholic Church, so I know it too well. And they're very big on ritual and on protocols and on ceremonies. And they invested the writing with this as well. So they started to develop poems which were formal, which had a very specific form. They were not contemporary. They were not ad-libbed. They weren't accompanied with a good drum and a good flute, you know? There was nothing of Mick Jagger in any of their poetry. And this is where we start to get formal poetry, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit when we talk about Shakespeare, who brings us all the way up to around the year 1600. There's a long period in Western civilization. I'm primarily talking about Western civilization in Europe, where we went through the Dark Ages, we went through the Middle Ages, and we come up to around the year 1600 when there's this explosion from the printing press, which is comparable to what's happened in our lifetimes with the World Wide Web. It completely changes our reality. With the printing press, all of a sudden, more people are learning how to read. More people are writing. And Shakespeare is around at that time, and he takes advantage of it. I'm going to return to him in a second. I want to tell you a little bit about me to sort of complement what I just told you about that history of poetry up to the time of Shakespeare. So I grew up in a difficult section in New York City. And for whatever reason, as a child, I read and I read and I read. And my parents were good with that because they were working class people and they thought, well, he'll do well in school. And the objective is to get him out of this rough neighborhood and into a college. Hopefully have a career where he'll make a lot of money. That probably sounds familiar to a few of you. But even as a little kid, I started showing these odd little propensities. I think about this today. Of course, at the time I was oblivious. When I was in the second grade, I bought my mother a little change purse for Christmas. Remember, I paid 30 cents for it at Woolworth's. That was my Christmas present from my mother. And my family wanted me to give that to her on Christmas Eve. And I exploded because I was into the myth of Santa. And gifts were not exchanged on Christmas Eve. Santa brought gifts and you opened them on Christmas morning. And that was how it was done. And no one in my family could get me to bring that little purse that I had so carefully wrapped as a surprise from my mom to give it to her. I was determined it was going to be under the tree until Christmas morning. And a few years later, in a more serious way, my grandfather passed away. And my grandmother had been estranged from her brother forever, seemingly. And I got it into my head that since there was going to be a formal ceremony, a wake and a funeral, that it was appropriate that he should come and attend this ceremony. And my parents looked at each other and then they looked at me like, what are you creating here? You know, what is this agitation? I felt there was a concern for the truth. I felt that this was a time for grandmother and brother to be reconciled. I have no idea where this came from. None. But I insisted on it. And sure enough, my uncle showed up at the funeral or at the wake beforehand. And I remember that to this day. And I mean, it didn't last. It wasn't like they were permanently reconciled and something beautiful occurred after that, but I made that happen. I know I made that happen. And today I look at those things and I think that's the type of thing that poets want to try to do. They want to make things happen. They are catalysts for communication and for change. Now, as time went on, I went through school, I had good grades, I wrote well. Any child who reads all the time develops a vocabulary and grammar and critical thinking and all the rest of that good stuff. But when I left college, I decided I was going to be a carpenter. A curious thing, also learned belatedly. The Latin for the word poet means maker. And a carpenter makes things out of wood the way a poet makes things out of words. Is that a coincidence, or was that just my karma that I began to put together? No one in my family was ever talking about poetry. No one was ever talking about being an artist. They were talking about doctor, lawyer. But I was in my 20s and I found myself up in Nova Scotia one summer trying to write a novel. And all summer, I could only get past the first chapter. And it wasn't too long after that that I read a biography of the poet John Keats, where certain qualities were enumerated which poets seem to possess. A concern for truth, a love for nature, and form, the form that the words took on the page. And these, when you think of it, are true for any artist. Artists are concerned not just with content, but with the form, with the expression that the content takes, whether it's in a painting or a poem, or in a sculpture, or in music. So in my case, I was almost 30 before I finally put all these things together, and I realized I was not just a writer, but a poet. And truthfully, I was way, way, way freaked out by this. I didn't know whether to be thankful or terrified, because all I knew about poets was they did things like put their heads in ovens. And other artists like Van Gogh chopping off their ears, you know? And I worried. I thought, how am I going to earn a living doing this? But that was sort of my introduction, or how I came to identify as being a poet. We title this as one person's or one poet's explanation because it's different for everyone. There are people who come into poetry in their 60s and 70s and find themselves writing and they say, wow, I'm a poet. At a certain point, it dawns on one when they integrate all their experience and they try and put it into a written form and to share it with other people. Okay, that was my first section. I'll probably repeat some of that here and there. That's a little bit about the history of poetry and my own little history. What I propose to do now is go through 4 poems with you, and hopefully Claudia can bring these up on the screen so that you can see what I'm talking about. And we're going to go back to the year 1600 with Shakespeare and look at one of his sonnets. Shakespeare wrote so many sonnets, he didn't even put titles on them. They just had numbers. So we're going to look at Sonnet 18. Great. You're doing great, Cynthia.
I hope everybody can see that. Can you see it? Can you see it, Jim?
We can see it.
I see it for sure.
I can see it.
Yes, I see it.
Okay, good.
Now, remember I said that the church was very, very much into ritual. And they came up with a very specific formula for how you should write a poem. This particular form of a poem, which we call formal poetry, is not meant to be performed with a drum and a flute. Let me enumerate for you what the qualities are in this 14-line poem. Not 13 lines, not 15 lines, 14 lines. It's composed of 3 stanzas of 4 lines, which we call quatrains. So we've got 4 plus 4 plus 4 is 12. And the last 2 lines, which are indented, are called a couplet. And that's the conclusion to the poem. And it's 14 lines. There's a very specific rhyme scheme for the end of each line, which if you wanted to put letters next to the rhymes, you could. Well, for time purposes, we're not going to do that. After the first 8 lines, the poem takes a turn. It shifts in its tone or in its story. And the English language lends itself to a form of accented syllables, which is most evident in the last 2 lines, which goes tum-tum, 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 like a galloping horse. These are called iambs. And a syllable which is not stressed, followed by a symbol which is. And when you get, that's called a foot. And when you get 5 of them in a line, this is the most terrible thing that high school students experience in English, you wind up with what is called iambic pentameter for you scholars out there. Okay. It's not so terribly important to know, but just to know that it's there. So, having pointed out those things, I'm going to read the poem. I'll read it twice. The first time to explain some of the language, which is archaic, because the English language was different then than it is now. And then to read it just for pleasure. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date, meaning summer passes. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, the sun, and often is his gold complexion dimmed, and every fair from fair sometime declines, meaning we're not always beautiful, either by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed, which we don't control. Now comes the turn. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou artst, thou art. Nor shall death brag thou wanders in his shade, when in eternal lines to come thou grows. Conclusion, iambic pentameter. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. So here we have a poem which praises someone as being beautiful and says, I'm going to make you beautiful forever. And maybe that's true because we're still looking at it 421 years later. But Shakespeare was considered a master of this form, as well as the plays he wrote, which were written in verse, written in poetry, not in prose. Now, is there anyone out there who'd like to read this? I'd like to hear someone else read it. Cynthia, are you there? Cynthia Rabinowitz?
I
How would
am
you like to
here.
read that?
I am. Thank you. Okay. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed, and every fair from fair sometimes declines, by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou erst, nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee.
Thank you, with that inimitable British accent to make it seem all the more authentic. Okay, we've just blown through Shakespeare pretty quickly, but it's a perfect example of a formal poem of a sonnet. Going to move along quickly now, going to come to the end of the 19th century, and we're going to look at a second formal poem, but one which is decidedly less so, by the Irish poet William Butler Yeats. The title of this poem is The Lake Isle of Innisfree. I will pause for a second while Cynthia Guazda brings this up for us. There it is, wow. Now, what do I want to say about this? Why is it a formal poem, although not so decidedly as Shakespeare's? Look at it. It's got 4 stanzas, they're each of 4 lines. And it has end rhymes. The last syllable in each line rhymes with one in a succeeding line. It has a pattern. The pattern is not quite so strict as Shakespeare's. So if Shakespeare's was a tuxedo, this is a business suit. Okay, it has all these conventions. It's also written in meter, although it's not the strict iambic pentameter that Shakespeare used. And I'm going to ask Rob Nestler to read this, if he's still there. Are you there, Rob? I see you. I don't see your face, but I see your name on the screen.
I'm here.
How would you like to take a shot at William Butler Yeats?
Well, I'm a little bit leery of that. You said there were 4 stanzas. I only see 3.
My error. There are 3 stanzas. Each has 4 lines.
I'll give it my best shot. The Lake Isle of Innisfree. I will arise and go now, and go to Innisfree, and a small cabin build there, of clay and wattles made. 9 bean rows will I have there, a hive for the honeybee, and live alone in the bee-loud glade. And I shall have some peace there, for peace comes dropping slow, dropping from the vales of the morning to where the cricket sings. There midnight's all a glimmer, and noon a purple glow, and evening full of the linnet's wings. I will arise and go now, for always, night and day, I hear lake water lapping with low sounds by the shore. While I stand on the roadway or on the pavement's gray, I hear it in the deep heart's core.
Yeah, good job.
Thank you.
Yeats, in addition to his formal command of the craft, was considered a very lyrical writer. And I would point out one line to you in this poem in the last stanza. I hear lake water lapping with low sounds by the shore. Look at all those N-L sounds. Lake lapping low. Your first thought might be that that's alliteration, but really it's not. It's what we call consonants. It's the repetition of consonants. They don't succeed each other, they're separated by other words. And that gives a musical quality to the writing, which you're not really aware of as you're reading it. But it's there, it's in the background. And Yeats does something different in this poem in the last line. He sort of changes the rhythm. He's got these long flowing lines. While I stand on the roadway or on the pavement's gray, and notice how he's changing the syntax to make the rhymes work. I hear it in the deep heart's core. Those last three words stand by themselves. Each is one syllable. I hear it, that's a foot. In the deep, second foot, heart's core. Boom, boom. So he's playing with the inflections on the syllables, on the words for emphasis. And that gives that last line all the more resonance because it departs from the rhythm of the lines that came before. And of course, it's chock full of images, small cabins of clay. A wattle is like a bough, sort of like a sapling, how you'd make a little shelter out of leaves and sticks. Bean rose, a honeybee, the bee-loud glade. Noon, a purple glow, that refers to the purple heather. Linnets are birds. And again, that famous line, I hear lake water lapping with low sounds by the shore. That's the end of the 19th century, and it's still formal poetry, but you can see where it's starting to break free of these conventions. It's not quite as strict as Shakespeare was. Okay, let's move on and look at Langston Hughes. Let's look at an American poet of the early 20th century. Although Langston Hughes was alive up until I think 1967. And he is sometimes erroneously taken as strictly a Black poet. But the truth is, this particular poem that we're going to look at, Mother to Son, even though it's written in a Black dialect, an informal vernacular, a Black vernacular, it's a universal poem. It's got a universal theme. It's a mother talking to her son. So this transcends any one time and place. You can be in Iran and still get the gist of this poem. You can be in Russia or China. This is so human. There's a human truth in this poem. Now, because it's in dialect, I'm going to take a shot at reading it. I want to say one other thing about it. This entire poem is a metaphor. It's a comparison. The mother is taking the experience of climbing stairs and comparing that to the experience of living a life. And you get that immediately, virtually in the second line, life for me ain't been no crystal stair. And it's extended throughout the poem. Tacks, splinters, boards, landings, steps. The metaphor is extended all the way through the poem. And another thing about this poem, so I'm trying to talk to you a little bit here about craft. This is what we call a persona poem. It was written by Langston Hughes, but it's in the voice of a Black woman, a Black mother. Okay, that's enough craft. How about the theme? How about the content? Well, son, I'll tell you, life for me ain't been no crystal stair. It's had tacks in it and splinters and boards torn up and places with no carpet on the floor, bare. With emphasis in that one word. But all the time, I's been a climbing on and reaching landings and turning corners and sometimes going in the dark where there ain't been no light. So boy, don't you turn back. Don't you sit down on the steps 'cause you finds it's kinda hard. Don't you fall now. For I still going, honey. I still climbing. And life for me ain't been no crystal stair. It's a pretty straightforward explanation and encouragement. There. That's the wisdom that we're getting here. Don't turn back, don't fall down. Keep climbing, because life is not a crystal stair. Someone told me that for all the renown and the many publications that he had, they did a survey of poets being Googled. And Robert Frost did not come out as the first poet to be Googled, but rather Langston Hughes did. I don't know if that's true or not, but he wrote so many poems. And the theme of his work is largely about the experiences of Black people in the United States in the first half of the 20th century. And you know these poems. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it explode? Or I too am America. Langston Hughes, I'm kind of digressing here, but Langston Hughes often wrote about dreams in his poems. And I believe, off what I've read, that Dr. Martin Luther King was an avid reader of Langston Hughes. It's a poem that we're not going to look at tonight is actually the I Have a Dream speech, which Martin Luther King delivered in Washington, which is always referred to as a speech. It started out as a speech, but about halfway through it, Martin Luther King looked out at all those people and decided he was losing them, and he launched into poetry. And sometime when you're watching a video of that speech, and you tend to see it every January 18 on Martin Luther King Day, you see that Martin Luther King's entire physiology changes. And he doesn't refer to a written piece of paper any longer. He just speaks, and his body swells. And instead of reading paragraphs, he talks in phrases. And one of the most famous lines from that poem is, when my children will be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. There's so much music in that line. Again, it's consonants, it's C sounds and K sounds. That's what makes it memorable. That's what makes it poetic. Poets find the right lines. Poets find ways to explain to us what we know is there, but which we don't quite have the words for. And when someone delivers them to us, we say, yes, that's it. That's what it is. You got it. At their very best. At their very best, they find the truth. They speak the truth, that everyone is feeling. So, you know, I have to believe that everyone in my family was feeling how sad it was when my grandfather passed away, that my grandmother was alone and on a certain level estranged from her next closest relation. And I know I felt that even as a child. I sort of intuited that. And I think that's why I made a big stink about it. And I think it was just innate in me. I think I was born like that. Of course, it got me into a lot of trouble in high school and college, because when I started picking flaws with teachers, you know, he said, son, you have an authority problem. Well, now as an older man, I say, yeah, at every good reason. It's kind of fun, you know, if I want to, and I could express a political opinion here tonight, because I'm not wearing my teacher's hat. When I'm in school, I can't express political opinions. But here I might. I just might let one go. Anyway, we got one more poem to do here before I pause for a moment. Let's look at Mary Oliver and the poem Wild Geese, which is going to bring us well into the 20th century. And now, just as it started with Langston Hughes and continues with Mary Oliver, we're no longer looking at formal poetry. We're looking at what is called free verse. Verse which is free of conventions, free of all these formulae that appeared in Shakespeare and William Butler Yeats. To refer back to Langston Hughes for a half second, that poem was one block of language, but it wasn't written as a paragraph, it was written as a stanza. And it lacked rhyme, although it did have repetition. Life for me ain't been a crystal stair. Now we're going to get another single stanza here with Mary Oliver in the mid to the late 20th century. And she does something, I'm just going to point out a couple of things here, and then I'm going to try and get Roseanne to read this, since she's been such a good listener out there. I would just want to point out a couple of things about the poem, though, before she reads it. Mary Oliver does something different in this poem. She shifts the point of view from the third person or the first person to the second person. And she talks to a universal you. She talks to her audience. And this makes the work very personal and intimate. It's a direct address to us, the reader. And this, you know, is fraught with potential problems, because the more you risk, the more you might fail. Mary Oliver is known for her spiritual qualities. Her poems have a very spiritual resonance to them. She's not shy about speaking about God. She wrote frequently about nature, was not very political at all. A lot of people compare Mary Oliver in the 20th and the 21st century to Emily Dickinson in a much earlier time. Okay, you got this, Roseanne? You can't go wrong reading Mary Oliver, because the words are just going to carry you. Give it a shot.
She needs to unmute.
Mary Oliver's poem, The Wild Geese.
You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees. For 100 miles through the desert repenting, you only have to let the soft antibody,
The soft animal.
what it loves.
Yes.
Tell me of despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese, high in the clean blue air, are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over announcing your place in the family of things.
Now, if you don't find that reassuring, I'm going to be hard pressed to reassure you. I mean, it's a poem about our connection with the universe, and she uses these images from nature as metaphors, as bridges. The Greek meaning of the word metaphor comes from metamorphos, which means to cross over. So we make these connections when we cross over, when we compare one thing to another. And those geese traveling from point A to point B, they're sort of like us heading home again. They're going somewhere, they have a purpose, and they're making quite a bit of noise as they travel, announcing their place. Now, in a different context, it would be terribly wrong to cover 4 masterpiece poems in the space of 40 minutes, but we did it, simply to get a sense of different types of poems. Let me pause here for a moment. I told Cynthia Guazda before we started, I once was at a reading by a famous poet. And halfway through his reading, he stopped and he said, "Now I'll answer questions." And everyone looked up like, "Now? You're going to answer questions in the very middle of your performance? Aren't you supposed to do that at the end?" And he said, "I just thought I'd like to do it a little differently." So let me ask you folks if you have any questions of what we've covered so far. I see a big R on my screen, but I don't see a person.
Does anyone have any questions? You can put your question in the chat or speak verbally if you just remember to unmute yourself.
Jim, it's Cynthia.
Yes.
The other Cynthia. It's funny, there's two Cynthias on here tonight. Why do you think that this stylistic, more formal approach to poetry writing changed in the 20th century? Why did it take, what was it, 300 years, 400 years? A long time before it might have eased a little bit from Chaucer and Milton to Shakespeare and so on, but it didn't get to be free verse until the 20th century. Why do you think that was?
Well, look at American society in the 1920s. Look at the flappers and the advent of Prohibition. We're a very puritanical society, at least in America. It was a style, you know, and not only was it puritanical in the United States, but across the Western world, the conventions were largely those of formal religions. When you think about it, formal religion had a much greater influence than it certainly does today. We've become a much more secular society. And in fact, Cynthia, if you would allow me, I started out by talking about the campfire and the conjunction of music and spoken word. And look at what today's poetry is. It wasn't but a few years past that Bob Dylan won a Nobel Prize for Literature, which freaked out a lot of academics. thought, wow, how did that happen? How did he qualify? But he was singing ballads. He was putting words to music, telling truths, using metaphors, using imagery, using language with rhymes, not perhaps the most learned rhymes, but with repetitions. Homer, during the time of the Peloponnesian Wars in classical Greece, was traveling around the peninsula of Greece on a donkey, reciting what became the Iliad and the Odyssey. So poetry has not always been this formal thing. It's a misconception to think that poetry is formal and it only appears in a textbook. Poetry is all around us in our songs. You turn on the radio, you watch a television show, you watch the Grammys, you watch the Country Music Awards, you're watching contemporary poetry. I can say that because even though I work in academia, I'm not really rooted in academia. I'm rooted in the west side of New York City and the Lower East Side of New York City and Boston, and a life as a carpenter largely. So I'm willing to entertain a much wider worldview of what poetry is, and I think I'm right. I had one poet in academia whom I could identify with, whom I always felt was writing wonderful poems. That was Maxine Kuhlman, who was one of our first poet laureates. And I managed to find Maxine Kuhlman. I wrote to her, care of the state of New Hampshire, and they found her for me. And I wound up attending a conference in West Virginia where she was teaching. And by then we'd exchanged a couple of postcards, and she very graciously sat me down and explained to me that poetry is a very big tent. So here was this woman who was a strict academic with all these awards, had a very formal style, telling me that there was room for all different styles under the tent. It's the greatest thing she told me. And to come in circular fashion to what you asked, Cynthia, because it was inevitable. We can't be tight-ass like that forever. Times change. And for language to be vital and for poetry to be vital, we experienced it when Biden was inaugurated, when that young Black girl stood up and read a poem. Now, I'm happy for what she did because it was good for poetry. I mean, as an older person who's taught the craft, I could pick little flaws with what she did, but that's not my place. She managed to get up and move people. That's what it's about. Moving people, communicating, catalyzing, finding the right words so that people say, hey, that was great. You know, that's why we're going to watch Dr. King year after year as he talks about having a dream, because that's a poem. The next time you see it, remember that's a poem. And watch him and watch how his body swells and how each of his sentences is a breath. Becomes naturally a rhetoric, a poem.
Can I ask a follow-up?
Sure.
You have time?
Sure.
So in other languages and the tradition of writing poetry and ballads, is there a similar path from the formal to the less formal and free, or is it only in English that we see this?
I'm not really best qualified to speak to that. Although my sense is today, and one of the things the internet did was it shrunk the world. So young people in Russia and Mexico are doing the same things that young people are doing in the States. So I'm inclined to think that the art form of poetry, is becoming looser and more creative everywhere. However, I would make one point about this for those of you who have a background in music. Some people learn how to play music with no formal training, and yet others have formal classical training and then go on to play pop music. The person who has the classical training, the formal training, will generally tell you that it helps their music to have that basis in structure and in knowledge of the craft, history of the craft. It just gives you another layer of knowledge that you can draw upon. And you can't, Frost, of course, said that writing poetry that wasn't in meter was like playing tennis without a net, that you needed these, you needed these strictures to shape and form the work. Well, you can play tennis without a net. I mean, you know, you might argue about a point or two and whether it was fair, but you can still bat the ball back and forth. On the other hand, you know, if you're really an aficionado of tennis, you want to see it at Wimbledon, and you want to see not just the net, but the lines. So a real aficionado of poetry might demand to see that formal verse, just to prove that you can do it, that you can command the language and make it fit those forms, and be a master at shaping the words into a message. You got me going. Anyone else? Who else has a question out there?
Jim, someone on Facebook, I was watching on Facebook, wants to know who your favorite poet is.
Oh my. Well, I don't have just one. Yeats is a big favorite. Mary Oliver is another big favorite. I like Pablo Neruda. Neruda has a line, a metaphor for our lives. Perhaps the earth can teach us as when everything seems dead and later proves to be alive. So he compares the changing of the seasons from winter to spring to what we experience as people. And sometimes when in our lives everything seems dead, we need to remember that spring may arrive and everything will bloom again. And we're in that place right now. So I realize now that I read poetry to learn things. I mean, I don't care at all about awards or publication credits, although a few have come my way. It's about learning. And I want to talk to you about magical tricks before I finish up here, since I threw that out. I think it is magic if you can find the right words. But what is even more magical is if you can find the right words and the right solutions for yourself to get through your own life. So Frost talked about poems being an idea finding form from a mood. And he referred to poems as a stay against confusion, a temporary resolution of some conflict. Well, poems can get you through when you don't know anything at all. Maxine Kuhlman, when I studied with her in my MFA program, she made us memorize poems so that they were drilled into our brains. And her rationale was you may find yourself a political prisoner someday without books. So you'll have some literature etched on your brain cells. So there's something to draw upon. Learned a lot from Maxine. She's one of my favorite poets. She was one of my mentors. And others whom I should mention. I'd also mention my dear friend Alicia Ostreicher, who was a mentor as well. Some people just show you so much that you're indebted to them forever. And if you find a poet whom you can read and really learn from, a lot of people have found these people in Mary Oliver and Langston Hughes and certainly Shakespeare and Yeats. I mean, that's like a friend for life. That's a guide for life. Someone whose wisdom informs your own. I thought I'd like to finish up in a very short section just by reading two of my poems.
Jim, just one moment. Elizabeth was asking a question. It's in the chat. She says, Jim, you mentioned that there was a gap of 300 between the first two poems. Maybe
Shakespeare around 1600, and I read Yeats, I think 1800.
What caused the change? I guess, in the style, you know, how poetry was written, maybe is what she's referring to. I'm not sure, but could what have caused the change have to do with the influence in people moving to America, or was the change because of the difference in countries? Did they speak like Shakespeare in England in the 18th century?
No, the English language changed. Languages are always changing. They're not static. They're changing today. I think, you know, it probably occurred in America because America was a more free-willing, blue jeans type of place, even back in the early 20th century. I mean, we have a reputation for being kind of laid back and laissez-faire, more informal, a culture on blue jeans and sandals. And it crept into the writing. But I don't hold myself out to you as a scholar. I'm a practitioner and a fairly humble one at that. That's just sort of what I've gleaned in putting this all together for myself. So I'll go ahead and I'll read these final two poems for you. May I? Shall I? Will I? Okay. I picked two love poems to read. I don't know if they're my best poems, but I know they're love poems. And Pablo Neruda said, among other things, along with that great line about the earth proving that all is alive, Pablo Neruda said that love poetry was more difficult to write even than political poetry. And he did his great share of both. So the first poem I'm going to read you is a sonnet, which I wrote, was one of the first poems I wrote. I probably wrote it as an exercise. It might seem that writing sonnets is hard, but it's not. It's like pouring dough into a cookie form. You know where the rhymes have to go. You know how many lines you need. It's actually pretty easy to write a sonnet, at least to get the form right. I taught in the Boston schools from age 28 to 32 in the first years of desegregation, when the school buses were being stoned. I felt that each year I taught was like a tour of duty. There were injuries, there were assaults. And reflecting the racial divide that continues in this country, which is a great theme in this country. And I'm sort of glossing this poem for you. I'm sort of framing it for you. And the third year I taught, I found myself in a school where I learned what the true color was. Because I found myself aligned with some young Black teachers against some older white teachers and a prominent Black teacher who joined with them. And you know, it was all politics. So the primary color was not black or white. It was not yellow, was not red. was green. It was about the money. And that's a lesson that's always stayed with me. And I had one teacher there whom I so much admired, who kept herself apart from all those politics. Her name was Julia. Julia was married. She was a very competent professional educator. And I so much respected and admired Julia. And I think we acknowledged each other without being able to become really familiar with each other. So here's what resulted: a sonnet. You didn't know I cared for you. You didn't trust your feeling, true. But your deep love was dark and strong, and for doubting me, you were wrong. You were stopped by what you saw, a yellow school bus stoned to bust the law. You were accurate to cite that. History lasts so long. Then, what? Workers, teachers, bookends, our special children made us friends. Their laughter mocks our pride and fall. I miss you, your face, your call. Love was for us our resolution. There was no black or white solution. And then this last poem, this last poem, I just said a few minutes ago that I read poems to learn. And this experience taught me so much. I took responsibility from my mother when she was 90 years of age. She'd been living with my sister. And one day a social worker called up and told me that my sister was abusing my mother and trying to get her to sign over all her assets. And sister's boyfriend shoved my mother. So that's how I wound up taking care of Mom for the last 5 or 6 years of her life. It was a trying time. Mom lost everything: possessions, health, family, estranged from grandchildren. She was really all I had. And I felt the responsibility. I felt like a soldier, her soldier. And I promised her at one point when she was uncertain, I said, I'm going to tell you this one time. I'm going to be with you until you die. So don't forget it. And that prophecy came true. I was supposed to go to work one evening. I was working in a group home, doing an overnight shift, 11 p.m., 7 a.m. For some reason, I was off that night. And I got a call around 11:30 from the nurse, and Mom by that time was on a dementia ward. And the nurse called up and said, you should come now right away. And I went over, and she was very close. And I sat down by her bedside. And I kissed her forehead, and the nurses will tell you that the sense of hearing is the last to go. So the nurses are adamant that people can hear us, even though we think they're not present. And I said to her, I promised you I would stay with you, and I have. And I sat down and I started trying to write something. And that's how this came about. First line. I accept this last night with you as gift and blessing. 1 a.m., and I am trying to scribble a line. I whispered in your ear, I have kept my promise to stay with you. Your breath is fast and hard. A hospice nurse strips morphine from the dropper to your tongue. I don't know what to do. I might write about 5 years we have traveled together, your gracious acceptance of what you lost and kept. You told me you once had nothing and could manage without again. What exactly are we taking with us? Question. As you quiet, I look up. You exhale. I write my second line. And that is all the time there is. You've slipped away, silent, no drama. The nurse comes, says, yes, you are gone. Your kind smile has left us. You take with you the love of all you leave behind. So for me, that last line is the knowledge. When someone leaves us, there's an emptiness, a sadness, and what's gone is the love. Because that's what we make in our lives. And that primary virtue of being kind. It's not about what we accomplish, it's about how we affect others. My mother was a terribly kind person, and she had friends for life. They never left her. And when she was gone, the love left. The Beatles have a line like that. In the end, the love you take is the love you make. It's what I learned sitting with Mom. So I thought I'd like to close with that poem for you. Knowledge poem, little love poem. Hey, I really enjoyed this tonight. It was really cool being here with you. I wish I could do my college classes like this. I never got to express those political opinions after all, but I will say I enjoyed Biden last night very much. Kind of scares me that we're so close to going back to a government dominated by the other party. But I guess for the next 20 months or so, we'll hope for the best. And I hope you feel encouraged to pick up a poem now and then and read it, or maybe even write a few yourself for your own knowledge and your own enjoyment. And then when you show it to a friend, you're officially a poet because you've shared it. And that's what I got to say to all of you tonight. Thank you, Cynthia, for facilitating this.
Oh, it was wonderful. Thank you so much for coming and doing this for us. Cynthia, she just commented in the chat. She said, this was great, Jim. You really expressed yourself well and shared deep and personal things. Thank you so much. It was special. So I just wanted to read that, and it was very special, and we really appreciate this. And I think it's been, everyone's really enjoyed it online too. I don't have the statistic yet to see how many views there are, but once I stop going live, I will be able to see that number, and I will let you know. So, but I did I am sort of watching the comments here, and I did have that one. Let me see if anybody else, okay, I don't see anything here, but if there are any other comments, I'll definitely send those to you. But thank you so much for this.
Thank you. Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Good
Cynthia.
night. Good
Bye-bye.
night,
Good night, Cynthia.
everyone.
Good
Bye.
night.
Bye,
Bye-bye.
Rob. Bye, Jim.
Bye-bye.
Good night.